Welcome to today's 360 Life video and the first in our new budget VR PC series. Today we are taking a look at this PC and how it performs in VR. This PC is built around an AMD FX 8320 with an MSI 990 FXA motherboard with 16 gigs of RAM, circa 2013-2014. Now, the question here is not should you buy one of these new, because you should not. If you are looking to build a new computer on a budget, there are much better choices out there. So the question is, if you can find one of these used at a very good price, or if you own one and want to know how it will stack up with VR titles, well, will this CPU serve as the basis of a budget VR PC is the question. We are going to run this PC through some VR specific testing using 3 different GPUs. 2 being VR ready and 1 representing what you might have found in a budget gaming PC circa 2014. The cards we are using for today's testing are a Nvidia GTX 1080, a 4GB RX 480, and an AMD R9 280 with 3 gigs of RAM. We are going to run the CPU at 3 different clock speeds to give you some ideas of what you may get depending on your specific CPU and its overclocking headroom. Those CPU frequencies being 3.5 GHz, 4.2 GHz, and 4.5 GHz. And the reasoning behind each of those is as follows. We started with 3.5 because any of the FX series processors are going to be able to achieve this speed, all with the stock cooler and auto voltage settings. We chose 4.2 next because while we were able to hit it with auto voltage, we were definitely pushing the limits of the stock cooler, so that's probably achievable with most CPUs as long as it has some upgraded cooling. And lastly, 4.5 gigahertz because that seemed to be the safe limit of this combo, but it still required a lot of voltage and upgraded cooling to even get it to boot into Windows. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump into the first benchmark, running the AMD RX 480 with VRMark's VR benchmarking utility. This is the Orange Room, which tests for the minimum recommended requirements for both the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift. We run each test 3 times and average the scores to get the results that you see. With the RX 480, scores range from 5308 with the CPU clocked to 3.5 GHz and up to 6372 with the CPU clocked to 4.5 GHz. We can see with these results, this system tests well above both the minimum and VR ready scores as determined by VRMark. The system averaged well over the target frame rates, and at 4.5 GHz, we saw a high of 139 frames per second. On to the Cyan room, which tests the system utilizing DirectX 12. With the RX 480, we see decent average frame rates with a high of 97 frames per second on average. The scores are well above VR ready, and with the small variation in scores between clock speed, we see this test is mostly based on the GPU. Now the Blue Room, which is the most intense of the benchmarks and runs at much higher resolutions and tells us the future readiness of the system. While the frame rates were low, coming in at a high of 24.7 average frames per second, the scores still remain above the minimum for a VR-ready PC. Now on to the next round of testing with the GTX 1080. The Orange Room benchmark shows a high average frame rate of 146 frames per second and very good benchmark numbers. We get a high of 6,929 at 4.5 GHz and a low of 5,645 at 3.5 GHz. With the GTX 1080, the system also tests quite well using DirectX 12 in the Cyan room. We end up with a high of 147 frames per second and test scores just stretching past VRMark's high-end rating. Clearly the processor is not holding back the 1080 too much to achieve these test results. Over in the blue room, we see a 49 frames per second average and scores well above the high-end rating. No thanks out to the GTX 1080, but it's nice to see the CPU not bottlenecking the system to the point of not being able to achieve good scores in these benchmarks. Finally, just for giggles, let's see how our vintage R9 280 does with its 3 GB of RAM. In the Orange Room benchmark, it scratches a high of 81 frames per second at 4.5 GHz, with the test scores coming in below the VR ready mark. There really is no point in testing this GPU with the other benchmarks, it's just not going to hit the mark. But that's completely expected. Well, after seeing these test results, I think it is safe to say yes. You could utilize an FX-based AMD system for a budget VR machine. If you are hunting on the used parts market, just make sure you get the motherboard, CPU, and RAM for a great price. Then you can feel confident upgrading the GPU, adding an SSD, throwing some more hard drives at it, or even upgrading the case and power supply. Then, once you are ready to upgrade the base system, these upgraded components will transfer right to your new PC. Do you have a different opinion? Let us know in the comments below. And if you liked this video and want to see more news, reviews, and our next budget VR PC build, make sure you subscribe and like this video. So until next time, don't forget to enjoy that 360 life.